I'm going to share with you a quote from Rex Brown's book, 101 Proof, The Inside Story of Pantera, where he discusses Phil Anselmo's heroin addiction situation, how Phil Anselmo overdosed during the Great Southern Trendkill tour, and that was one of the sparks that really created the intense tension within Pantera. He talks also about the making of the album musically, and then how after a few years getting into the Reinventing Steel era, the substance abuse in the band had gotten much worse, and that substance abuse ultimately contributed in a big way to the end of the band. Rex Brown touches on the death of Dimebag Darrell and, of course, Dimebag's funeral. It's a really interesting book, and I definitely recommend picking up a copy if you want to hear the inside story of the band from Rex Brown himself. He also mentions that during the Reinventing Steel tour, the band was stuck in Europe during 9/11. That's also an interesting tidbit I'm going to share with you here. But first, let's start off with Great Southern Trendkill and Phil's heroin situation. Quote, "The Great Southern Trendkill, from a musical sense, was all about further experimentation for us. And for a lot of our fans, it's their favorite record. But personally speaking, it's the record that was kind of lost on me. It's not commercial at all, I get that. But from a band perspective, it had some great music on it, but it's just not my particular taste. When we started it, we had an important collective decision to make. Where were we going to go? Here's a band that always says we're going to get heavier and heavier. But how much heavier can you get without completely malfunctioning? The answer? Heavier still. Trendkill was done a bit more off the cuff than we tried before. We wrote in the studio, usually from a riff that Dime came up with, and instead of having, say, 40 songs to choose from, we just focused on doing 10 that were killer. Like before, Phil was in Texas instead of New Orleans for most of the writing process. We'd go in for 2 weeks until we became frustrated with one another and reached a point where we all said, alright, screw it. And at that point, Phil would fly out home to New Orleans. We'd take a breather, maybe a month or so, and then all get together again to start the process over. Unlike the early days where we'd go in for 30 days straight until it was done. The daily routine went roughly like this. We'd get up, go and have lunch, and then start putting stuff together. When we'd come up with something we liked, we'd call Phil in to listen to it. He'd then put in his 2 cents and we changed things around until we found something we all liked. As always, we were extremely precise about how things sounded. Sometimes I would keep my original bass track if I liked it, but 8 times out of 10, I'd fix the bass tracks later, which is difficult because you don't have that live feeling that you do when you're all playing together in the studio at the same time. I remember when we were doing the demos for some of the Trendkill tracks, there was this bass thing that Vinnie didn't hear when it came to the final tracks. It totally threw him off, of course. So I ended up redoing it because he picked up something he didn't quite understand. It was just a little piece of improvisation I threw in there at the last minute. But Vinnie said no, you have to do it the way we did it in the demos. That's how rigid Vinnie was in the studio. Despite any personal issues that Vinnie and I would have, we were always very synced in the studio. When we write, we pretty much go with the first idea that comes to us. We always relied on that gut instinct approach, so it would have been a mistake to start second-guessing that because it had always worked to that point. Whatever drum lick Vinnie came up with, I just found a bass riff that complemented it. Not surprisingly, our producer Terry Date claims he has 600 hours of tape from the Trendkill sessions alone, although I've never heard any of it. Even as it stood, Trendkill was so difficult to play because we were playing lightning speed most of the time. This was thrash to the ultimate. Metallica had taken loads of chances with what they were doing by releasing Load. When we were doing Trendkill, we admired that, but I think it continued to push us in the totally opposite direction. Personally, I like melodies over the top of heavy stuff. That's important. You can't say that Vulgar didn't have hooks and Far Beyond Driven didn't have hooks. They both did. But it was almost as if Phil went completely out of his mind with Trendkill, with his drastic vocal and lyrical style change. It was obvious during the writing process that lyrically, this record was heading down a much darker path. And if you're asking me whether that was connected to Phil's state of mind, then I'd have to say probably so. The guy cut off all his hair for one thing. I followed suit because my hair was down to my butt and I was just tired of it. But I think his reasons were altogether different. Not just that, he has started wearing wristbands and socks over his hands, presumably to hide something. So maybe his lyrics weren't the only indication of bad things to come. With that said, I couldn't tell in his eyes that there was a drug problem because I'd never been around anyone who'd been on heroin. But he would make these obvious gestures to me occasionally. He'd hit his arm and stuff like that. And I'd just say, really? You want me to join that club? Not interested, pal, and never will be. I knew pretty much what he was doing, but I don't think the other guys had any idea whatsoever. For the record, I never thought that alcohol and heroin would mix very well in my lifestyle. I thought it would have been one or the other, and I chose alcohol. Now, Phil wanted to be at home in New Orleans whenever possible. There's no doubting that. It seemed as if his personal isolation went hand in hand with his drug issues, but he was still focused enough to deal with his vocal tracks on Trendkill as he ever was. What helped a lot was he had somewhere to do his work away from the rest of the band. Trent Reznor had a really cool studio that he just built in New Orleans. Every time we'd stop there, we'd always go to Trent's place. We were hanging out pretty regularly, even though we never toured together. Trent had made so much cash from Pretty Hate Machine that he now had 2 different studios, both with SSL consoles. So with Trent and us, it was always a case of, if you guys ever want to track down in New Orleans, come by. Phil took him up on the offer, and so our producer Terry Date went with Phil to New Orleans, where they would record the vocals, send them to us back in Texas, and then the rest of us would either say no or just go along with the new direction Phil was heading in. Since we were apart like this, it made it difficult to have a conversation about the vocals, so to avoid wasting time, we'd occasionally just say okay and move on. Maybe it was because he was away from us and he was in the initial grip of heroin addiction, but Phil's vocals sounded very different from any of the previous records. For a start, he was doing a lot of double tracking and narration within the songs. He would double take one track, then come back with this other track right behind it with these fast words, something that was almost impossible to replicate live. Then, on the other hand, he'd have an emotional textured song like Floods, which was simply beautiful. I remember when Dime first brought it to me, I loved it instantly. I tried to come up with a bass line that worked, and it became one of my favorite bass lines in our entire catalog. Dime's girlfriend Rita Haney once said the following about Floods. The Floods guitar solo was something that Darrell used to play in the pre-Phil days, and he once made me a sleep tape, which I still have. It consists of 90 minutes of that solo with all the harmonics forwards and backwards so that I could fall asleep to it. But once I figured out Phil's lyrics and what they pertained to, I hated listening to it, and it ruined the song for me. Obviously, I got past that and I can now derive other things from the lyrics, but none of us realized that Phil had gone that dark, and it was coming out in his lyrics. Again, that was from Dime's girlfriend. Now, we started touring Trendkill after it came out in May of '96. We were all hitting it extremely hard. When you're partying like that, you really can't tell what the next guy's doing, so it wasn't as if we were watching Phil and wondering what he was getting into, because it was full-on debauchery for all of us in our own way. We were playing a show in July of '96, one of the first on the Trendkill tour. It should have been a raucous homecoming, but it turned into something else. I remember that night well. There was something very weird going on in Phil's dressing room, which was the next door. I recall that all these crazy people popped out of the woodwork, and I just thought, well, this is kind of trippy. There was always weed being smoked in Phil's dressing room, heavily at times, so much that you can get a contact buzz as soon as you walk by the door. But I wasn't really smoking and drinking at this time. At that point, I was kind of tired of it, so my memory of that night is as vivid as if it were yesterday. I remember this one dude in particular hanging around, someone I knew back from the old days, and he's looking at me with these red glassy eyes saying, "Yeah man, what's going on?" Doing this head shuffle thing, and I remember thinking, okay, let's see what this is all about. In my mind, I knew there was something amiss, so I said, "Look, what are you on?" I asked him straight out. "Oh, nothing, man," he said, but it turned out that he was the guy who brought heroin, in that night. Now, in those days, I had a personal car and driver for me, my sister, and the rest of my family, and they would take anyone wherever they wanted to go. We were making the kind of money that we could afford to have limousines drive us wherever the heck we wanted. So after the show, just as my sister is heading home, it suddenly hits the radio wire. Phil Anselmo, singer with the rock band Pantera, has overdosed on heroin. And all I could think was, who the heck had that scoop? It seemed that somebody knew quicker than they should have. Something about the whole night just didn't seem right to me. When I went into the dressing room, it was a scene of total chaos. Phil was blue because he had shot up after the show. Paramedics were called in and there was nothing I could do, although what I really wanted to do was beat the crap out of Phil. As a compromise, I took out my rage on the dressing room. I started throwing bowls of chips and chili around to release my anger. It was sickening and I was furious. How the heck could he have done this? How could he put all of our livelihoods at risk like this? The three of us met that night while Phil recovered in the hospital. The next morning, the boys picked me up in Dime's Cadillac and we all went over to the hotel to confront Phil. He'd gotten out of the hospital already and had this girl with him who would die of an overdose shortly later. It began to feel like there was some kind of a dope plague going around. Anyways, we said to Phil, "What the heck is this? What's going to happen? This could be the very end of everything." Management was no help at all. The best thing they could have done would have been to immediately put Phil in rehab, cancel the tour until he was clean, and then we could have had all continue with what we were doing. But that didn't happen. Of course, when he was in front of us, Phil simply said, "I'm sorry dudes, I really screwed up." What else could he say? But his response to the fact that the overdose was now public knowledge was more of a problem. For some reason, Phil wrote a confessional letter about his near-death experience. A public statement saying, "I saw no shining lights," or whatever the heck he said. It's all well documented. And that was the dumbest thing he could have done as far as I was concerned. Because the moment he did that, he was labeled a junkie. Why would you do something like that? And why would management let him do it? They should have covered that up, and that's all there is to it. "Dude, we're flying," I said. "Money's through the roof. What are you doing?" Of course, Phil said it would never happen again, and we gave him the benefit of the doubt because when we examined the situation in the cold light of day, it wasn't like he was in a coma every day. Even we would have noticed that. In fact, I suspect he hadn't actually been using heroin very long and had just been dabbling a little bit. But he just happened to be very unlucky and overdosed. Nobody's perfect, and there certainly aren't any perfect people in the business of rock and roll, so of course people are occasionally going to have problems. Despite the fact that we were willing to move forward after that fiasco in Dallas, I'd be lying if I said the thought of getting rid of Phil didn't cross our minds. But it only did so briefly and probably only as a knee-jerk reaction to what had happened, driven by our lack of understanding and experience with what was actually going on. Deep down, we knew that kicking out Phil would have been like ripping your heart out of your chest or siphoning all the gas out of your car so you can save the car. Makes no sense. There's no gasoline to make that car run, so you're keeping it for what? Totally pointless. We knew that to carry on without Phil would have been pointless too. Even then, and to this day, he is one of the best frontmen in metal. Nobody commands an audience like he does. So we did carry on, and after only one day off and our singer almost dead, Pantera was back and ready to hit Oklahoma. While an element of trust had perhaps been lost after Phil's overdose, that feeling mellowed out over time. Because when you're on tour, you just have to get the job done no matter what. And in Phil's defense, and to his great credit, he generally held it together thereafter. If he was still dabbling with heroin at that time, it didn't affect the band. Phil's approach to life was always fairly consistent for half a decade. He was all about extremes in everything he did. That's how it is with him. If he's into sports, it's boxing. If it's horror films, it's the hardcore gore stuff. He's just into the extreme edge of anything. In keeping with that personality type, however, he also had an extremely sensitive side to him that he never really presented publicly, other than in his lyrics. And because he and I lived together forever, I'd seen it. Now, fast forward a few years to the Reinventing Steel era, that's when I suppose the writing was on the wall, as early as pre-production for that tour. Phil was out of his mind a lot of the time, and there were moments in rehearsal where Dime and I would look at each other and say, "Dude, Phil's singing a different song than we're playing." That's how bad it got. When we actually went on tour, however, Phil killed it every night, which is typical of him. He rose to the occasion. But while the shows were good, the animosity backstage left some things to be desired. Not just with Phil, though. For example, Dime was on his own with Vinnie on the bus, and he was starting to hate being around his own brother. I'm sure he grew jealous of me because I moved out and no longer had to deal with it. I was in a crap mood most of the time and found myself jumping down people's throats at the slightest provocation. When I wasn't doing that, I drank more and more to numb that ill feeling. Drank more and more. It got so bad that at one point, Dime came to me and said something like, "Dude, how much do you think it would cost to buy my own tour bus?" I just said, "You're crazy, man. It'll cost way too much, and if you're going to do anything, you'd better be off trying to rent one for the rest of the tour." But he didn't do that. He just drank more, too, in an attempt to block out all the BS. The craziest thing is, later that year, in 2001, we flew out to Ireland in early September. And then, 9/11 happened. We were stranded in Ireland, and our hotel was 2 blocks away from the U.S. Embassy. Tensions were cranked to 11. All we could do was sit and watch the news of what was happening in the US, and it was truly frightening. I was in a suite with my living quarters on one side and a TV room on the other side, and my room became a crew headquarters because I had a full case of booze that we carried around with us. We had stashes of bottles for days, but it was unclear what was going to happen. I stepped out of the hotel maybe one time in the 2 weeks we were stuck there, only because one of the security guards beat up our lighting guy, so it was my job to take that dude to the hospital and everything. But eventually we got home after Dublin. We had to fly over the Arctic Circle and down through Chicago to Dallas. Pantera never played live again. Substance abuse got worse, tensions grew higher. 2003 was the year where communication within Pantera was at its most strained. Phil basically dropped off the map completely and wouldn't answer anyone's calls. Not the band, not the managers, nobody's. I never talked to him, but I was caught in the middle of trying to talk to him. Instead, he went off and did his whole super joint ritual thing, and he hardly told us he was doing it, and the rift between us got deeper and deeper to the point where I walked past him at a show somewhere, and he didn't even recognize me. But the tension wasn't just with Phil. One time I said to Dimebag over the phone, "Phil and I are just tired of you guys, you and Vinnie, being such jerks. You think you're being cool to people, but you're not." Yes, the phone call I made to Darrell sometime in 2003 is something I wish I'd handled differently. It was one of those late-night loaded type deals for sure, but I meant everything I said. How I couldn't stand all of Vinnie's BS and how I needed a break from all things Pantera for a while. When you're caught in the middle as long as I was, sooner or later the levee's gonna break, and when it finally did, I had to say what I said. In the back of my mind, there was more to it than that though. I just had kids and wanted to see them grow, so that time off that I needed was going to fulfill that purpose too. But in retrospect, I think I confided in the wrong person. I probably should have just told my wife or something and vented it that way. I actually thought at the time though that Darrell had taken what I said all right, but the next time we spoke, it was obvious that he hadn't. He called me the next day and said, "That was pretty harsh, man," and I apologized, reminded him I was loaded and that again, I just needed a break. But now there was this distance between us that I hadn't felt before. 2003 continued with very little direct contact within the band at all. I ran into Darrell at a Motorhead show in Dallas a few weeks after that phone call, and he wouldn't even talk to me. I'll never forget the look on his face. I still have it in my mind. It was a horrible, terrible look, but what could I do? I said what I had to say and couldn't take it back. Vinnie and Dime were really hurt by what was happening, and at a certain point, they just said, "Screw it. We're going to start another band," as if to say, "Screw y'all." I didn't understand why that sentiment was directed at me, but when it was, that line was drawn in the sand. I was all for them doing their damage plan thing, so I just said to Dime, "Do what you gotta do, man." As I've said before a million times, I wanted time away from all things Pantera. Now, periodically, I'd have to deal with communication from the Abbotts, Vinnie mainly, but all he would ever do was complain about what Phil was or was not doing. So there was nothing really for me to do or say. Phil still wasn't talking to us. We were in limbo. And while I was happy to finally have some time to spend with my family, I had no way of predicting exactly what Phil's longer-term plans were, particularly when he recorded a second Superjoint record and started intimating in the press that they were his main focus. We were now in the middle of a he said, she said BS thing in the media where Vinnie and Phil took increasingly personal cheap shots at each other in the music press. Dimebag stayed out of the conversation mostly, but did allude to Phil's ongoing drug issues in an interview with Guitar World, but only after being provoked earlier. I didn't get involved at all. I said nothing whatsoever. It all seemed so childish to me, and I felt that the only way to really reconcile would have been for us to all be in the same room at the same time. However, Phil was still using. That much we did know, so I suspect nothing constructive was going to happen until he got clean. And when that time would have arrived, I would have then had to be the one to get the two sides together to at least start discussing the future. Until all those components fell into place, I decided that I was going to stay far away from all of the playground name-calling BS. In 2004, as late as November of 2004, Darrell and I spoke on the phone a few times, and it seemed as if we were both at least on the same page regarding what we had hoped for in the future. Dimebag and I had been friends since we were kids, after all, and it seemed that despite how tense our relationship was at that point, Neither of us was prepared to let go of the time we'd spent together. It meant something. Yes, there have been hurtful things said, but the reasons for that were mostly because of the general tense situation than any personal issues between us. Hand on my heart, I believe that. So when you boil it down to the basics, there really was no blame to be leveled at any one individual. We all wanted to be working on something, to be making music. So if it was necessary for us to all go our own separate ways for a while, so that we can come back to Pantera later refreshed, then that seemed like the obvious way forward. And quite frankly, the only way to get back to where we once were. However delicate our relationship was throughout most of '04, the events of the night of December 8th ensured that we would never know what the end result of the conversations might have been. Darrell had been shot and killed on stage with Damageplan. What is really strange is that the previous night, I'd had a dream about Dimebag, and in that dream, I had to babysit him. It was bizarre. Phil and I would always discuss our dreams. And that morning, the morning of the day Dime died, December 8th, as Phil and I were talking, he said, "Screw all this BS, I've got to call that guy. I'm going to call Dimebag today." Then people came over to the house and he never got the chance to make that phone call to Dime before we got the terrible phone call about Dime's death. I've said already that what happened that night not only shook me profoundly, but it also left an indelible print on every second of my life since then. Band tension created by years of close quarters is one thing. The loss of life, particularly when that life belonged to one of the people dearest to me on this planet, is entirely another thing. In an instant, all the petty BS that had plagued us for years seemed completely meaningless. A more immediate concern was the fact that the line that seemed to have been drawn in the sand between the band members meant that the funeral was going to be awkward territory, especially as far as Vinnie and I were concerned. For me, it was the fear of the unknown. I just didn't know how Vinnie was feeling because we simply hadn't been communicating. As it turned out, the messages I was receiving were mixed at best. Obviously, Vinnie was distraught about what had happened. We all were. But there was that contradictory aspect to how he viewed me that he just couldn't hide, despite his sadness. He wanted me there, but he also felt that I was in some way to blame for his brother's death. Go figure. I really didn't know where I stood, and if I didn't know, Phil would have had no clue whatsoever about where he figured into the overall equation. I know Phil was flabbergasted by Dime's girl Rita's threats about what she'd do if he came to Texas, but at the same time, he was also very respectful of her wishes. However, we all knew where Phil was habit-wise, so for him to just show up would have been a terrible move. Looking back on it, I feel bad that he never got any closure. Yeah, that really sucked. Being completely excluded and then having to sit there and not be able to talk to anyone must have been very frustrating. And that feeling must have only been heightened when his letters to Vinnie were completely ignored. The source of Vinnie's bitterness was an interview that Phil did with Metal Hammer sometime in late '04. Phil's exact comments were that Dime deserved to be beaten severely. Obviously, this was before Dime's death. But that comment led to the public's assumption that this was the catalyst that led to Darrell's shooting. Phil said that the comments were fabricated or at the very least taken out of context, but I have heard the tape recordings and I know what was said. But if you're asking me whether I feel there's a direct connection between the statement and Darrell's death, I would have to say no way. You can't speculate about the mind of a killer, and Phil was in no way to blame for what happened that night whatsoever. The press just took hold of his words and spun them to suit their own narrative goals. To me, it was just a case of ill-chosen words combined with really unfortunate timing. But that's no consolation to Darrell or those close to him. Knowing what Dime was like, the only possible consolation for him was that he was buried with Eddie Van Halen's guitar, inside of a Kiss casket. Terry Glaze, our producer, said that at the funeral, if we told Darrell he'd be buried with Eddie Van Halen's striped Kramer off the cover of Van Halen, back when Dime was 17, he would have probably said, okay, kill me now. Now, the funeral itself and the days that followed it were some of the most emotional days of my life, and it's hard to remember one moment from the next. It was almost as if I wasn't really there at all, but was merely looking on it from somewhere else. But one thing I knew was that the pain I felt at the loss of my best friend was real. And then there was the constant unanswered question of why this happened. I badly wanted to find out, but there were no obvious answers. Life got harder after Darrell's death, there's no doubt about that. I thought about him all the time and still think about him every single day. And even if my words here have been critical, I do have a lot of empathy for his brother. I need to say that. Life is a far less wonderful place without Dime in my life, and he was my best friend for years, until we became estranged by circumstances. But that will never change how I feel about him as a human being. End quote. I'm going to show you now a clip from my interview with Pantera producer Sterling Winfield and Pantera studio engineer Tim Kimsey, where they discuss Pantera's bad breakup, Dimebag's death, and then going back a little bit earlier in the timeline, the making of Great Southern Trendkill. If you want to see the full interview, the link is available in the description box below. The relationship between Dime and Vinnie, during Damage Plan, was their relationship the same, or did, I guess for lack of a better word, the bitterness of how Pantera ended, did it affect them as people in any way?
Yeah, it affected all of us. We thought Pantera would live forever. It was too big, it was too powerful, it was too good to be not only destroyed, but destroyed in that fashion so publicly. And it was a huge betrayal of all of that brotherhood and the way that it happened. And what was going on with Damage Plan was that it originally started as just me and Dime in the studio, and it was going to be his solo album. Because when we got done with Reinventing the Steel tour cycle, we were in Japan, and we said, Philip was getting ready to make a Down record, because Philip made the demand that, hey, I'm not making another damn Pantera record until I make the next Down record and I get to do something different, because he was growing weary of Pantera. So not only did that happen, but Dime and Vinnie were the ones that went to bat for Phil to get his record deal for Down 2. So they were the reason he got his deal with Elektra. And so during that space, well, Dime was going to go do his thing musically. And that's what we started on. That's what Damage Plan ended up being. But as we got further through the process with Damage Plan, and Vinnie started hearing some of the stuff we were doing, and he was like, man, I can lay some drums on that'll sound killer. Let's do this. And Dime's only stipulation was, I don't want it to sound like a Pantera record. This is my record. And he was like, fine, but let's just go do it. And so we started all working together, me and Dime and Vinnie, on those songs. And then as we came through, the next month or two, after we're still working on this stuff, here comes all this stuff on the internet of Phil and Rex talking trash about this whole thing. And we're literally sitting there looking at each other going, what is going on? What is happening? And that was the beginning of the end right there. And yeah, it changed them. And then at a certain point, they were like, we've got to move on. We have to, there's no reconciliation here. We have to move forward. And yeah, they weren't real happy about going from playing arenas back down to playing clubs, but that's what they did because they loved the music. They wanted to keep making music. And so they just kept moving forward, and that was going to be the thing. Well, we're not going to do Pantera right now. We're going to do Damage Plan. Hell, we didn't even have a name for it for the first 10 months that we were working on it. We worked on it for over a year before we released it. So yeah, it was an odd time, and it changed all of us, not just Dime and Vinnie, but me too, and a bunch of dudes that were on the original crew. And it just, it changes a lot of shit.
Were you there on tour with Damage Plan the night of Dimebag's death?
I was not. I was home. I was on that tour about 6 months before all that went down. I got to a point on the Damage Plan tour where my drinking had taken over and I didn't want to be there anymore. The beautiful thing about those guys was, hey man, if you need help or you need a break, take it. And that's essentially what happened. And I left the tour because I was not happy anymore. Me and the tour manager got into a fight, and I was tired and just beat down. And so I went home. yeah, I was not there that night. And had I been there, who knows how my life would be right now.
You know? Well, I can almost tell you, and not to elongate this conversation about that, but one of the things that I remember when Sterling called me that night, and I remember very specifically where I was, and the mood went from, hey, we're getting ready for, the holiday season, so on and so forth, to shit. Man, it's almost like tunnel vision. The moment that Sterling got those words out of his mouth, it's like, my whole world has now changed. I'm not anywhere as close to these guys as Sterling was, but I don't know if you remember this, Sterling, but one of the things that I said to you is, I thank God above that you weren't there.
Yeah, I remember.
Because
I was pretty obliterated, but I remember.
I think you might have been all up in that.
Oh, yeah, I most definitely would have. The whole fight or flight thing.
Yeah.
What do you do when you're faced with that? And no one knows until it's that time. So I don't know. I don't know what would have happened. And everybody says that. I'm glad you weren't there. But there's that survivor's guilt that happens.
Sure.
Lots of therapy later. I can tell you that that's just the way that was meant to be.
Yeah.
It is what it is.
That's nuts. When that happened, I mean, I guess, Sterling, this would be a question for you. Was it a guaranteed damage plan was done, or was that not even something people were thinking about at the time?
I think it was a guarantee done. Just like at that point, I think it was also a guarantee that Pantera was done. Dime was the heart and soul of both of those bands. And with Vinnie included, they were the ones that came up with all of that stuff. And without those two, it never would have happened. I'm not belittling Rex or Phil or their parts in any of this. But yeah, both those two bands were completely done when that happened. And I think that it basically put the cork in a very short and powerful legacy. And also that it put the end curly Q on this will never happen again kind of thing. Any legitimate reincarnation furthering of any legitimacy to any of that, it will never happen again, because they only made one of those, man. They made one dime and that was it.
Yeah. Did Vinnie ever recover fully from Dime's death, or did that never leave him?
Never left him.
I don't think it's left any of us.
Yeah. No, it changed all of us in different ways. But no, after that, he went on to do Hell Yeah. I was there for all of that. And he got to go out and play and have the joy of music back in his life after his brother died, which he thought he would never find again, but he did. That's but good. Not like that, not on that level, and I don't mean financially or successfully, but just that bond that he had with his brother musically. But yeah, that he had a hole in his heart. He was literally a different person after his brother died for the 13 years that he was still around. He was not the same person.
Yeah, it's sad. But I mean, it goes to show how close they were and how important that relationship was. So
they were not twins, but they should have been twins.
Obviously, we know what happened. If that didn't happen, if Dimebag was still with us, was Damage Plan going to be a long-term band, or was there always the thought of reuniting with Pantera eventually?
Knowing Dime and Vinnie as people, I would say that Pantera would have eventually gotten together, and it would have been Dime that would have facilitated that. Because Dime was the kind of person that didn't like holding on to that shit. And it would have eventually righted itself, I believe.
I agree with Sterling. Sterling was much closer to all of that than I was when all of that started going down. But just once again, I've said this before, the character, a a lot of folk think of, Pantera being this just angry or maybe aggressive, this or that. But the truth is the just the, I don't even know what the right word for this would be, but the human element with these guys was just impeccable. They
could have been assholes, but they weren't.
They weren't. Not ever. That's and cool. I think it's fair to say Sterling and I both, we've encountered a few of those along the way.
Oh yeah. Hell, I encountered some yesterday.
Sorry, dude.
It never ends.
Sorry, man.
Nah, man, I think Dime would have totally righted that stuff. They had they're brothers. They fight. The bands fight. It's a marriage. It's a 4 or 5 way marriage, and you're going to fight. You're going to argue. Even the best marriages need maintenance. Even the best relationships have rough moments, and just multiply that times 4. And that's the dynamic you have in a room full of dudes that are trying to create and have a common vision. Just that alone in and of itself is a most difficult task. To get someone to share the same vision with another person. And if you get 4 people that share that same vision, even for a minute, that's an amazing thing.
You guys were talking a little bit earlier about the relationship between Dime and Vinnie creatively. Was one of them more the leader than the other, or were they kind of equal in that sense?
Totally equal.
Yeah.
Totally equal. No one dominated each other. They worked as very much symbiotically.
Personality-wise, what were they like? Were they very similar, or were they different?
No.
Different, yeah.
No, they were 2 very different people. Vinnie was more like the business guy. He was more like the guy that, for the longest time, he kind of held the whole thing together because he made sure everybody got paid. He made sure that there was somebody to drive. They made sure that, he took care of all the business stuff. He learned from his dad. And then as the years went by, Dime really started stepping into that role as well. But I would say Dime was more, and not to say that Vinnie wasn't a loose cannon, but Dime was more of a loose cannon in that respect. He was a giant child. He was fun. He had that video camera rolling all the time. He was always looking to laugh. He was always the guy that lit up the room. Vinnie was a little more, I'm not going to say reserved in that way, but Vinnie was more of a kind of read the room, and Dime was more like be the room.
Oh, that's cool.
Does that make sense?
Very well put, Sterling. Yeah.
Yeah. It was,
and it wasn't out of a need to feel like he was the attention center. He was the room, as Sterling said.
It was, it wasn't, I need attention. Look at me. It was, and this is said with the most heartwarming kindness. But it had to do with, he wasn't on or off. It was just him. And he was, whenever he met somebody, he made that person feel like they were the only person in the universe, and he was completely focused on them. He wanted to make sure that they were happy and having fun, and that we were here to rock and roll. And he made everyone feel like that, not just a fan or me or Tim or whatever. It was that he truly was, I think, a very empathetic person. And I think that he fed off of positive energy and exuded that as well. He could light up a room like nobody and still make you feel like you were the focus, that you were, he was there and he was talking to just you,
So, in terms of the production on Great Southern Trendkill, do you know why the band chose to record that album in such dark tuning?
I don't know. That was the last record they did with Terry, and I don't know. I want to say that they here we are coming off of Far Beyond Driven, which was not all the same tuning. They had a couple of tunes that were standard tuning for them, and then they had a couple of songs that were like a drop C type tuning, which C sharp, which was things like 5 Minutes Alone. I'm just trying to think back to some of my tuning charts from touring, because I was Rex's tech. I don't know that there's an exact answer for that, honestly, because they were experimenting with lower and different tunings, because the whole Cowboys album is almost A440 standard tuning. There, I think there's one or two songs on that album that are a drop D. Then they get into Vulgar, and they started going into this C sharp tuning. It was a standard tuning setup, interval wise, but the way tunings work, it is a thing that guitar players especially explore, and new tunings inspire new riffs or pieces of music, especially in the heavy metal thing, which led to that whole subgenre called gent. And so I think you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And so that in turn, every album that they did, there's more of that there. And Trendkill, they really got low. They started using really big gauge E strings, and we're going down to like A sharp, I think. I mean, that's really flipping low on War Nerve and Sandblasted Skin. Those are like drop A sharp. And so that whole album really lit, because the tunings were going lower and lower. That those tunings inspired heavier riffs. They inspired heavier music, darker music. And I just think that one was a product of the other, kind of thing. One thing fed the other, so to speak. But I wasn't in the room for a lot of that, because if you were to ever see their studio when it was here, it's no longer a place. But when it was built out and it was a place, the control room was very tiny. It was just a small building, and it was a very tiny control room, and the outside room where they tracked drums and everything was an open room, and they would put guitar amps and bass amps in there. It was all one big open space, and there wasn't really any, you couldn't fit a bunch of people in there. So I wasn't there a lot for that one. I was up in the house tuning guitars and teching basses and stuff. So it was Terry Date and Ulrich Wild at that point, doing the recording and the producing on that album. So I wasn't there for a whole lot of it. I did do a little bit of guitar recording with Dime when Terry and Ulrich weren't available, but as far as the philosophy of that goes, that's my take on it. And that's where they were headed with it. Dime was always looking for something new.
That's so cool. Do you ever
want to go heavier, want to go darker,
Yeah. Did you work on Floods by any chance?
No, I didn't. That was Terry Date.
Hey, no worries. So then just a general question, because if you look at the chronology of Pantera's records, I mean, the first 4 records, it was always 2 years in between. And then there's this 4-year gap between Southern Trendkill and Reinventing. Is there any particular reason why the band took extra time, or did it just happen that way?
Well, the live record happened in between. So they were touring that recording that was mixed from McAllen, Texas, was on the Great Southern Trendkill tour. We literally mixed that album while they were in the middle of Ozzfest. So they came home on a break from Trendkill, recording all the Trendkill stuff around the world. And we went through all of those shows and tapes and stuff, and we found kind of a pattern, if you will, that this Texas run that they did on the Great Southern Trendkill tour was just awesome. They were hitting on all cylinders. We grabbed this one particular show from McAllen, Texas, that was the best of all of them. We said, we're going to mix this one. And then they went back out on the Ozzfest. They came back home. We mixed that album while they were on that break. And then I went back out with them to go master the album in New York. And then we went back out on the Ozzfest. they dropped the live album as a release. And then we started the tour cycle for the live album immediately. So they didn't ever stop touring or making music in the studio. It went from one thing to the other very quickly. And so a lot of people overlook that, well, here's the gap, but we were making music and touring. We were touring for the live album. Yeah, I know it sounds funny.
I was going to say, yeah, I've never heard that before. We're when
you put it into perspective chronologically, yeah, they did the Trendkill tour. Then we did the live album. We recorded and mixed 2 brand new songs for the live album. Then we put that out and immediately went back out on tour for the live album. Then we went back and did Reinventing the Steel.
So I got one question about Reinventing the Steel. It ended up turning out to be Pantera's last record, obviously. Was there any sense that could be the case when you were working on it, or did that surprise you guys?
It hit us out of the blue. No, we didn't have a clue. We always thought, hey, we'll come back and do another Pantera record. But other things, drugs happened.
Yeah. But I mean, if I'm not mistaken, and correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, weren't drugs part of the story throughout it? Like, did it get much worse by the end? Was that the main thing?
I would say it was a common theme, not so much with Dime and Vinnie, but with the other members of the camp. I would say that was a common theme throughout things. Alcohol, most definitely, for sure, that was breakfast, lunch, and dinner for some of us. That's that. But yeah, it was the whole lifestyle. And we used to have a saying, drink it or wear it. It was, dude, one of the reasons, like Tim was talking about earlier, about them going to bat for us when Terry was saying, well, I'm not sure I need these guys, was because we could keep up with them.
Gotcha.
We could be mentally on the same page as them and not flinch. And so I think that was part of it too. And if you could do that, they not calling that any kind of a great accomplishment or a great badge of honor, but it was something that, hey, this dude can keep up with us and still do his job. We need to bring him on board. And I think that's how they looked at it. It was a nightly thing. We had to drink just as much as the band did and be on the same page. That's how we got close as we did. They wanted us on the same page mentally.
It definitely was all for one for all. I mean, I had it expressed to me, look, you're going to go. And I think I mentioned this to you as well, Daniel, earlier, was that it didn't matter whether we were going to go see another band perform somewhere or if we were going to just go have dinner in some cases. We did that as a collective group. It was never, Dime is going to go have dinner by himself and Vinnie Paul is going to go have dinner by himself or with his friends.
Everything together.
Everything was together.
We would go, when I would go on tour with them, and we would be on tour with each other for 3 months in Europe and be miserable and want to come home, and we'd be all at each other's throats like you do when you live with somebody in a bus for months on end. And then we would literally fly home from Europe and be like, I need a break, blah, 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 blah. And it wouldn't be like that. It would be like, all right, we're going to head home, get your drinking shoes on. We're going to go. We did everything together for years.
That's awesome.
On end. And it wasn't, I hate you. It was never like that.
That's so cool, man.
It literally was a brotherhood, if you want to think of it as that.
That's awesome.
It really, really was.
Not to be sentimental or anything, but I think that changed my life. That right there, when I said, that record changed my life, I think that was a part of what changed it for me, was because I was really used to being, the hired gun that was coming in. I was hired to make records. That's what Sterling and I did. But with them, it's like, no, you're going to be a part. If you don't want to be a part of that, no foul, no harm, but you're not going to be here with us. If you don't want to participate, there's no room for you to be here.
Yep.
And so we learned very quickly. And I quite honestly, Sterling, I never really thought of it that way, but I think there's some great truth in the fact that maybe the fellows kind of looked at Sterling and me and saw that we were willing to go the distance every day, including, keeping up with them, whatever that meant. On some cases, it was like, I need for you to run to the grocery store and go get us some groceries.
Yeah.
That's cool, man.
And whatever.
Lovingly, hey, send me. Let's go. Let's go do this. We got stuff to do.
So Sterling, do you remember working on Revolution Is My Name?
Oh boy, do I.
What was that like for you, man?
It was great. It was it required a lot of work. I remember it being a very long, drawn-out process. This is when we started jumping off away from 2-inch tape and back into a digital format. This actual machine right here, the very one.
Really?
An Otari radar, yeah. That very machine right there was the one that did Revolution Is My Name. And we worked on that song a lot. There was a lot of, they were kind of getting off into some territory where for that whole album, they were very adamant that they wanted to make it kind of not retro sounding, I think is the wrong word, but they wanted to make a nod to the forefathers, the Black Sabbath, everybody, all of their influences, and they were really tipping their hats in that direction. And so Revolution Is My Name is about that. It's about some of that stuff that they were influenced by. And that song, just the intro, I remember me and Dime working on that intro piece where he's doing all of those pinch harmonics and it's going up and down, and we've got that timpani sounding drum in there and a kettle drum, and it's just this huge epic bunch of stuff going on. And I remember me and Dime working on that for a couple of weeks.
Really?
Just to get all of those guitars to sync up just right and double up just right, because at the end of the day, the reason that so much work was put into these things guitar-wise was because it had to be meticulous, because he was one guitar player in the band. He was the guy, but he wanted it to be massive, and so he didn't want it to sound like a 2-guitar player band where there's kind of a looseness there. He wanted it to be as tight as possible. It feels like it's one performance, as tight, doubled as tightly as possible, if that makes any sense. So a lot of his parts were meticulously crafted in a way that it sounds like one guy, So
yeah.
Which, by the way, if you guys will allow me to kind of step in, that's
Absolutely.
how Far Beyond Driven was as well.
Yes.
I mean, I still have guys to this day, when we break it down, to listen to the multi-tracks, they go, oh my, I had no idea.
Yeah.
I had no idea that this is
tight.
More than one guitar part.
Mm-hmm. They are that solid with one another. Whereas usually when somebody goes back and stacks something in a recording studio, it's a little loose. You can hear it give and take. But with Dime, it was just tight, watertight.
Would he kind of improv his solos, or would he write those out?
There was a couple of times he improv'd a solo, and we were like, you're keeping that. It was that first take is golden thing. Every now and then there would be one like that. I remember one on Reinventing the Steel like that, and we were like, do not touch that. And then he would come back and just do like a little bit of like, he wouldn't change the part. He would just execute a note or two better kind of thing. And we would be like, do not touch that. That is perfect. We're not, because there was one night I remember in particular where it was just like, hurry up. We're going to be late for last call, what we call last call every night, hitting the bar. Mm-hmm. And he was just like, all right, let me put a solo on this real quick so we can listen to it on the way to the bar. And he whipped out this solo real quick, and it was like, that's staying on the album. That's not going anywhere. And we kept it, cool. Note for notes. That was on Reinventing the Steel. I don't remember which song. And then there was another song on Damage Plan called Moment of Truth. That is like a 2.5 minute long solo. That is all one take.
That's cool.
One take, one first shot. By the end of that solo, when he did that, I've got a whole other story about that particular night, but that is a one take solo. But most of the time he would have his solos worked out before he came into the studio, because he would have, we had the studio there at Dime's house, the main studio. And then he had his own little, what he called a 4-track studio upstairs in his house. And he would sit up there, and somewhere there's a closet full of 4-track cassettes of him working out solos.
That's really cool.
Yeah, I had to go through a bunch of stuff to find some multi-tracks, and up in his closet, there's literally a closet where there's boxes and boxes of cassettes, and they're written on it. It says fucking Hostile solo.
That's
solo
awesome.
1, fucking Hostile solo 2, Shedding Skin solo. All the stuff that he did, and he would sit up there and construct these and work on them, and then he would come in to record. Kind of away from the demo is going to end up being the album philosophy.
Gotcha.
But again, he treated these solos like they were a song inside the song. A lot of them were meticulously worked out, and he was looking for a certain thing. Some of them were only half worked out. And then he would sit there, me and him would sit there for hours and he'd go, all right, what if I hit this with this augmented riff? Okay, what if I try it diminished? What do you think of that? What if I pick this up legato? And he was actually very musically.
That's cool.
A lot of people don't know this, but he was actually, I wouldn't say musically educated, but he was musically smart in that regard.
And I was going to add to that and also say extremely organized amongst the chaos.
Yes.
Extremely organized amongst the chaos. So what might appear to be one person's total, you got to be freaking kidding me, we're going about it this way, totally would make sense when you broke it down. Exactly what Sterling was just saying right there. If you were to go back and take a look at some of the notes that were probably written, cassettes that were done, one of my pet things with Dime was always he had that camera going 24/7, and it literally, I'm sure there are things that were caught that would have never, that were captured that we would never think a second thought about. But it's there. It's totally there. There's absolutely, in my humble opinion, total genius amongst what might appear to be chaos going on.
Yeah,
that's really cool.
And then some of it was chaos for the sake of chaos. All right, let's do this. Let's plug in 10-foot pedals just to see what sound they'll make, and that's what we're going to roll with. Never to ever be touched or reduplicated ever again, even if you tried. Stuff that I would never even thought of, crazy recording scenarios, put a mic in the bathroom, and then we're going to compress that, and then we're going to run it back through a guitar speaker and then mic that. It's just crazy stuff, dude. And stuff that I even took notes on that I could never even duplicate today if I tried.
So Dime had a very producer savvy mindset. Would that be fair to say?
Absolutely. Him and Vinnie both. Dime's came from more of a musical side, and Vinnie's came from more of a technical side, and the two of those coming together was what helped that happen.
Which, by the way, Daniel, and I'm sure that you probably know this, but that is very, very rare to get technical and artist side where they can actually speak the same lingo and actually know what's going on. That made such a big, big difference to even those of us who were kind of, and I say this respectfully too, but those of us who were on the outside kind of looking in on their bubble for that period of time.